companies that are driving the agenda, research agenda, that they are not the ones that have the highest funds for research, that instead of kind of trying to mold ourselves, our research around their capabilities, around data sets, etc., that we need to be able to look at different ways of, okay, what are our biggest issues?
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Engatica's interview series. I'm your host Dingo Sagar and we're really glad to have you join us today. And today we have Merve Hickok, founder at aiethicist.org. Welcome to the show, Merve.
Thank you, Dingo. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So before we get started, a little bit about Engatica. The Engatica interview series is a powerhouse of insights from industry experts and influencers from around the world. A platform that provides the latest news on AI, automation, technologies that will help you grow your business. Come be part of our community. Let's learn and grow together. So, Merv, so could you talk a bit about aiethicist.org? What are some of the problems that you solve out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So AIethicist.org is a platform that I founded many years ago, and it grew out of my frustrations when I started researching on AI ethics and bias and social justice, etc. back in the time. As a researcher, as someone who was coming into the field, and I was finding it frustrating not to be able to find some of this stuff in an easily accessible manner. Um, and mind you, there wasn't this much of conversation of AI bias and explainability and social justice back in the time. So I started gathering all the documents in a curated way, all the research and reports, etc., that I was interested in, and tried to make it a useful platform, useful repository for researchers. In my shoes, it ended up being one of the world's first repository of its kind. And I still curate it regularly, now have more than 800 research and reports on curated material there. That eventually led me to kind of go a bit further, organically grow into training and consulting. So one of the things that I do through aiethicist.org is provide training, self-paced training, as well as tailored organizational training for capacity building. I go into the organizations and build the fundamentals of AI ethics, AI governance, sometimes sit with C-level and board level, and do that level of training. And similarly with consulting, I provide consulting, AI ethics and governance, and responsible AI and governance to organizations of different size, anything from startups to national organizations.
Right. I guess these are like really key important areas that we need more people to look into as we more and more use AI products on a day-to-day
Yeah,
basis, right? Yeah.
absolutely.
So,
So yeah, it
right.
touches from anyone from developers to project managers to C-level and board of directors. So anything and everything between. So absolutely.
Right. So my next question is regarding these biases. So in general, the deep learning models that we have today are data hungry. So the more data that feed into these models, the better they become, right? And one of the ways in which we train these models, for example, these language models, which excel at understanding human language and text, is basically training them on this enormous text data available on internet, and that is like a huge corpus of data available in the public internet, right? And but because of this, again, the internet is open and uncensored, and the data coming from it also is representative of the biases and discriminations and everything expressed by humans, right? So now when we build these products and surveys based on these AI models, which was trained on all this data, naturally the bias and these issues is carried forward and the model learns all these biases. So, So how does that? How do we ensure that it doesn't end up hurting people, or like acting in the bad ways when we put these systems to end users? Like, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Absolutely. So I think there are a few things to mention here, especially with large language models. Uh, the bigger, the larger the data set, the larger the corpus doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean it's better. It just means that wherever your source is, wherever you're sourcing it or your sources are, that you might actually be embedding or magnifying the bias embedded in it. What is happening with a lot of this work is, as you mentioned, Dingo, they're sourced from the internet, from forums, Wikipedia, from different online forums, etc. So they're not necessarily purpose created. Instead of creating a data set as uh, that is purposefully created and curated and labeled and controlled in an accountable manner, with transparent audit details, etc. What you're doing is kind of with all that scraping, you're putting together what is available. So you're not creating something for your purpose. You're putting something together that you hope is going to be the answer to your purpose. And obviously, that brings a whole um, group of questions and issues with it. We not only we see this in large language, but imagine computer vision, we're creating object data sets, whether it's like pictures of things, pictures, faces, videos, whatever it is. A similar problem, as long as you're dependent on scraping and not having a proper best practices and guidelines in terms of how do we collect this data, how do we data sets, how do we label them, how do we manage them on an ongoing basis. The issues is going to be replicated, and I think that the third element that is on top of it is there's only a handful of organizations who have the resources, time, money, people, resources, and computing power resources to actually put this corpus together on large language models. And even then, they are doing a lot of scraping. So all the other organizations that have less resources are kind of dependent on these data sets that were curated or that were put together by the bigger organizations. So there's that kind of a dependency as well. You don't necessarily understand the provenance of the corpus or like the limitations. And honestly, not many organizations go into the limitations or trying to do their own research into the corpuses that they are using. So the thing is, starting from the sources themselves, it just becomes a bit of a snowball of issues.
Right. So I guess the source becomes little uncontrollable because of the sheer scale of the data set, right? So maybe one thing which I can think of is we have benchmark data sets that we benchmark the accuracy of these models on. And then we should have specialized data sets which would evaluate the models, let's say, fairness and uh, like discriminating behaviors. And then uh, and the research community should probably test it on these kind of specialized data sets, and then that would probably give a better idea. I mean, it's not very easy to curate these data sets. Again, that also involves a lot of manual effort, but because the problem can't be fixed at the source, which is basically the data set size, right? So this could be like one of the uh, possible solutions. Just a thought I had. Uh, so again, you were pointing about big tech giants, right? And who claim to have systems and design guidelines in place, which they claim that would help to make AI more fair and more uh, inclusive, and which would also take part of the, I mean, take care of the ethical aspects of it. So one question that arises is, because these are the big companies who have these resources to do that. How do people make sure that these decisions made by the big companies are in the best interest of the people, right? So do we need like a more democratic frameworks to define these guidelines? Because everyone is getting affected by the product, because everyone is like an end user, let's say, but these decisions tend to be made by only like a small group of people. So what are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree with you about decisions being made about smaller group of people and who's around the table. And at this point, we're pretty, we've been saying that that's not a diverse and inclusive group of people to start with. So to your point, we need democratic practices and inclusive practices, uh, starting like through the whole cycle, starting from defining the problem to solve until you retire a problem and anything in between. We keep saying that that project, that product development, whatever you're doing, needs to include impact, anything from impacted communities to external stakeholders to civil society. Again, depending on the context, some products might not necessarily need that, but some will definitely, especially depending on the impact or possible harms, you need to have those communities to have a say. And something that we see, especially with big technology companies, and I do appreciate that there's a lot of good stuff coming out of those companies as well, right? There's definitely a lot of like free sources, open sources, but then we need to remember that they're also the ones kind of gatekeeping the data sets, the computing power, as well as the direction of research. Uh, what is currently happening, being researched, and a lot of funds going into the kind of research that is going into is really what is going to make money, or what is going to drive the most product development for these companies, not necessarily things that will help democracy or equity or equality, or things that will, for example, reduce poverty or gender gap, gender pay gap or gender representation, etc., around the world. That is not the priority. Whether it should be the priority or not, that's a whole different question. But if you want AI, if you want these models, if you want this technology to benefit a wider group of society, we need ways where it's not only these companies that are driving the agenda, research agenda, that they are not the ones that have the highest funds for research, that instead of kind of trying to mold ourselves, our research around their capabilities, around data sets, etc., that we need to be able to look at different ways of, okay, what are our biggest issues as a society? If the society had these resources, what are the things that we should be trying to solve, rather than what are the things that are going to make the most money uh, for those companies, and make them more powerful. I think we need to look at mechanisms to reduce that power imbalance between society and the companies.
Right. I guess, yeah, those are valid points. I guess. Do you think government intervention at some point is required to enforce these guidelines? Because we could define guidelines, and but if people don't follow it properly, right? And there's no.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not like one or the other, not only regulation or not only guidelines, right? These are all complementary governance mechanisms. So when you're talking about AI or AI products, etc., we definitely need a good balance of both. And sometimes So one thing I didn't mention at the top of the podcast is I'm the research director for Center for AI and Digital Policy as well. So we do a lot of AI policy and regulation advisory work around the world. We have students from 60 different countries now, and we provide that advisor to a number of different governments and multinational organizations. So we are seeing we're sitting right in the middle of this like regulatory and policy developments as well. And something that we have seen over the years and over time is a lot of the companies, including big tech, those small like startups, are actually asking for some regulations. For some clarity, because they know there are issues with bias, they know there are issues with governance and accountability, etc., and that they might be in trouble or they might unintentionally harm their own consumers, etc. So they keep asking for some clarity, provide us a regulatory framework of what we can do, what we cannot do, how we should go about documentation and accountability, etc. So they want that clarity to be able to innovate better and have that kind of a framework available. So we're saying from European Union to US to on the other side like Singapore and Japan, Canada, Germany, there are a lot of individual countries as well as these bigger unions or markets that are now putting together regulations that provide some uh, technical and governance framework for these companies. Because to your point, when it's only voluntary, some companies will make some uh, uh, trade-offs. Some will not have, especially when it clashes
Right.
with other resources.
I mean, it's interesting. It's really good if companies come forward and they're conscious about these problems that these AI products can create, and they're being proactive and solve those issues before even they arising, right? But there is a usual trend that let's get to the market fast,
Yeah.
do quick prototyping and validate, and but then if the damage is already done, then there's a problem. So I guess companies
Yes.
becoming more conscious about this is interesting and really good. So that brings us to the end of the interview questions I had. So do you have any other thoughts you want to share with our audience?
I'm really looking into kind of keeping the we talked about governance and we talked about accountability and democratic involvement, really looking at both sides of that spectrum as civil society and communities and society in general. How can we look to keep both the governments and the companies accountable? Because also it's not only the companies that are using these products. We see more and more uh, public entities using AI products for public services, access to public services, etc. And we see similar problems of bias in those services. How do we keep them accountable so that the society is and consumers and citizens and however you define your end person or end groups that they are best served, and then we keep the power a bit more balanced and we can keep these organizations, public and private, more liable and accountable for their work. But also inside the organizations, I think there's a lot of, uh, despite all the resources around AI bias and guidelines and developing policy frameworks, etc., there's still elements of you don't know what you don't know. So a lot of the organizations that I work with are coming in to this with the best of intentions. We want to do good. We want to develop AI responsibly, uh, but they don't know anything. So we start with capacity building, start from the fundamentals, actually understand what you're doing. So this capacity sits within the organization eventually, and I'm not coming in again and again as a consultant. That it becomes, second nature within the organization itself, and then it's naturally reflected in the products. So I'm hoping to see that kind of transformation over time. It's moving slowly or slower than I would hope, but there's definitely the transformation.
Yeah, right. I guess that's a great way to end it. I mean, if everyone, the users of the product and the builders of the product and all the stakeholders are moving into that responsible AI, the whole idea of building responsible products, then that serves the best for the everyone, right? So great way to end it. And thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights with us. So for guys, more content, subscribe to Engatica and tap the bell icon to get exclusive access to content from thought leaders around the globe. Thank you for tuning in. We will see you with a new expert soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye, Dingo.
Thank you. Bye.